December, we finally made it. We're almost done with 2024, and we have some daylight losses to talk about. But the good news, on top of all the snowy, cold weather that we expect in December, is that we're not losing much daylight anymore. In fact, our last full month of daylight losses was back in November. In December, we don't lose daylight all month long. Starting on the 21st, that's the winter solstice, we start gaining it back. I'm 13 News meteorologist Matt Standridge. We wanted to take a moment and talk about the daylight losses that we'll have throughout the month of December, and then we'll start gaining it back a little bit right there at the end, right next to Christmas and headed into New Year's. And because of those daylight losses still, even though they're very small, what kind of weather, of course, do we normally get in December? You know it's cold and snowy, but let's get into some of the weeds. Let's talk about some of the details that we can expect, and we'll also take a look at things like clouds and just temperatures and how they kind of evolve throughout the month of December. But it all starts with daylight changes. That's why we even get differences in our weather. So in November, if you remembered, we were still losing 40 minutes, 50 minutes, even up to 60, 65 minutes across much of the U.S. For December, not as much, because the pace has really slowed down. At the start of the month, we're still losing about a minute or so, but then by, let's say, December 10th, December 15th, we're only losing a handful of seconds. And then on December 21st, it will be the shortest day of the year. And when I say day, I'm not talking about the 24-hour cycle. Of course, that doesn't change, but day and night, we have the shortest amount of day, the longest amount of night. And then slowly we're going to start to kind of equalize those, and we'll eventually have more daylight as we get into parts of the spring. So right here in Indiana, we're kind of in this royal blue color. We're at least losing 8 minutes across the state. And not a huge difference from north to south, but we still get the differences from north to south. Just bigger daylight swings take place the farther north you go. In fact, if you go north to northern Alaska and northern Canada, some of those folks are still in complete darkness. They're going to have more darkness for about a month and a half left before the sun will start to finally reemerge above the horizon. But this is a dark period for us. It is the darkest month of the year. So a lot of darkness, a lot of clouds. It's kind of a dreary month, but that's how we get some snow with the colder weather. Closer look at home, we're losing 9 minutes in Fort Wayne and South Bend, but the rest of the state, we're losing about 8 minutes, give or take on some of the seconds after that, but about 8 minutes for the rest of the state. So not a huge difference. You know, when we're in fall, we really start to notice, at least mid-fall and early fall, you really notice the daylight change every day. You don't notice it as much. It's kind of slowed down quite a bit. Let's take a look at sunrises and sunsets. December 1st, we start with a sunset at 5:20, and then we'll end with 5:30. So just a little bit later. We start to notice our sunsets getting a little bit later rather than our sunrises. So sunrise is still getting a little bit later there, but not to the same exact pace or so. But 8:05 at the end of the month, so that sunrise will be just after 8 o'clock. So right before we head to Christmas break, a lot of kids will be going back to school in the dark. Remember, we had that time change, and then we get back to the 7 o'clock hour, but we're starting to get close to 8 o'clock again for our sunrise. Shortest day of the year, winter solstice, December 21st. Shortest day means we're only getting 9 hours and 20 minutes of daylight. And a lot of times it's cloudy daylight, so it's not the full force of the sun. So we're losing daylight a little bit more, but then we're going to reverse course. Starting December 22nd, we start gaining a little bit more daylight. It all has to do with the tilt of the earth and how we go around the sun. We're tilted at 23.5 degrees. We stay that way, but depending on our orientation against the sun, it depends on how much daylight that we're getting. So for the winter solstice, the northern hemisphere, the North Pole, at this point is pointed away from the sun. So we've got more darkness in the northern hemisphere. You can see the South Pole, then Antarctica, they're staying with the sunlight. They've got a lot more daylight. Many times it's just daylight all day long, even through the night. It's just daylight for them. But then, of course, we'll reverse course as we head into March, and then eventually the summer solstice, where we'll have maximum daylight there in June. June will have that maximum daylight. So with that 23.5 degrees, we're tilted away. We got the shortest day of the year. So now let's get into what the weather is actually going to be like. So we'll put daylight off to the side. We know that we have more nighttime, which means we escape more heat out of the atmosphere, back out to outer space. We're not gaining enough heat to replenish what we lose. That's why we're colder this time of year. And that's why the Arctic regions really get cold. And every once in a while, they'll share some of their cold air right with us with a big old cold front. And the start of December has some really cold air. We'll have to see how the rest of the month really takes place. When it comes to snowfall, we get a few inches, about 6 inches in December on average, 2.92 inches of precipitation overall. And that's accounting for some of the snow when you melt the snow down. You know, you don't get 6 inches of just water necessarily when you get 6 inches of snow. You melt it down, it's a lot less, depending on the snow ratio that we're getting with some of these snows. Generally, much of the month is spent in the low 40s and some upper 30s. But we still get some huge swings throughout the month of December. We can easily have some days in the 50s, and we could easily have some days that are just in the teens and the 20s. But overall, we start the month with average highs right around 45. We'll end the month December 31st, wrapping up the year. About 37 degrees is our average. So once again, we're not always at average. We're always somewhere around average or way beyond average. We're below average, but this is kind of the general trend. Snowfall. Let's get into the weeds on how much snow that we typically get throughout the month of December and then also throughout the whole year. Now, these stats are specifically for Indianapolis. When you go farther north to South Bend and Fort Wayne and even Lafayette, our snow totals are a little bit higher. Not just because we're colder, but we're closer to Lake Michigan. We usually get a little bit more of the lake effect activity, especially when it comes to South Bend, Elkhart, and Michigan City. But for Indianapolis, our typical total snowfall is right there around 25 inches. Now, if you add up these numbers, we're not quite to 25 yet. We usually get just a little bit of snow in November and then maybe a little bit of snow in April and sometimes even just a little bit on average in October. Usually it's a couple flurries, but every little bit counts to get to that total. But the 4 snowiest months of the year for central Indiana, December, January, February, and March. December is our second snowiest month. Just over a half foot of snow is what we typically get. January is the snowiest. 8.8 is what we get on average. Now, this doesn't always play out. Sometimes we get just hammered in December with more snow. And we get a snow drought in January, and we may not really pick up much until February. Also, December is an interesting month too, because the lake water temperatures on Lake Michigan are typically warmer. And so you're able to get more lake effect snow showers. Sometimes by late January to February and March, there's more ice cover, depending on how cold it was that winter. There's more ice cover. You can't really have that lake effect snow process. You need open water, and you need somewhat fairly warm open water, depending on the air temperature kind of blowing right by, in order to get that lake effect snow event. So December is usually a lot of snow showers flying around, and some of those beefier winter storms really come into January and February. But 6.4 inches is what we typically get, and then March is kind of wrapping up the snow season for heavier snow. We still get sometimes snow, you guys know, in April and even sometimes in May. What we definitely get this time of year are the clouds. This is a depressing stat. Not only is it the shortest daylight month of the year, our shortest days of the year, it's also our cloudiest time of the year. So essentially you could kind of combine those two and easily say it's usually our darkest month of the year. We could use some sunlight, we could use some warmer air. That's just hard to do in the month of December. When you look at December, 60% of the time we are on the cloudy side. That includes overcast days and it includes mostly cloudy days. So when the sky is mostly filled with clouds, you get some sun breaks. We're going to call that cloudy. So with this graph, and this chart, the black color shows you kind of the percentage there with overcast, and then that darker gray shows you the mostly cloudy. So for example, for the month of December, 17% of the time we're mostly cloudy, 43% of the time we're overcast. You put those together, we're at 60%. So December is the cloudiest month of the year. Now we're not too far behind for January and February. It's not like a huge difference. You won't really notice a difference, but generally December is our cloudiest month of the year. And with that cold air, we're going to be watching chances for snow, and something that we are tracking for this December is the snowpack. Once you get really into Canada and parts of the Arctic and kind of on the other side of the globe, Siberia, they're in parts of Russia. When you have a lot of snowpack and a lot of ice pack, which of course we typically get in winter, but sometimes depending on the week, we can have a little bit more than average or a little bit less than average. But we've got pretty decent snowpack heading into December. And so that's why the first start of December has been trending on the colder side, and we've got that colder air for the first part of December. We'll have to see how this kind of plays out. That white color shows you snowpack. It is snow covered in parts of the northern U.S. and of course the mountains of the U.S. and the Rockies. But once you get into Canada, even the open plains, they are covered in snow A lot of these lakes, call it the prairie pothole region, a lot of these are frozen over. Then the pink color shows you the Arctic sea ice. You can't get to water there. It is just covered in ice, and that goes all the way to the North Pole. So we generally watch the air just sit over the snow and ice, and it gets actively colder. You create the cold air, it gets really dense, and eventually you pile up so much cold air, it wants to move. It wants to move to an area that's warmer, and we are warmer. We might not be warm, but we are warmer. That cold air comes right at us. So throughout the month, we're going to be not just taking a look at individual systems passing by, but we're going to be taking a look at what we call the source regions of the cold. How's the snow doing? How's the ice pack doing over the oceans and some of these lakes to help us figure out how robust some of these cold air outbreaks will be. We know we're going to get them throughout the month. We typically do, and we normally get about 6 inches of snow. In November, this past November, we got above our average. We got over 3 inches of snow throughout the month of November, so we'll have to see if that above average snowfall kind of takes place for December. But generally, overall for the winter, we are expecting about average. It's about 25 inches or so, or maybe just slightly less. So our kind of snowfall forecast in general is about 18 to 25 inches of snow we're expecting for central Indiana. It's been a snowy start for November, so once we get to the end of December, we'll have to retally things up and see how we are. But January and February typically get good amounts of snow as well. So it's December. Hopefully it's a good month, but for sure it's going to be a wintry month at times.